Thank you for joining today. My name is Anson Davies. I am a trainee educational psychologist at the University of Manchester, of course. And today, what I'd like to talk about is, I guess, a bit of a problem which I'm contending with at the moment in the research that I'm doing. It's not a problem which only I've contended with, it's a long-standing problem. But I would, by the end of this presentation, like to show a potential solution or a solution that's in progress. And it would be great to get some feedback on that, because it's very much a working solution. It's definitely not solved anything. And so I guess just a bit of a background in terms of what the problem is I'm trying to solve, because in the research that I'm doing, I'm looking at trying to evaluate a school intervention. And I'm trying to look at what are the psychological well-being outcomes of young people, children and young people, participating in a specific intervention called Philosophy for Children. And when we're looking for the literature, I was looking at intervention research, I was looking at well-being definitions, and I think it's self-evident how important well-being is, in the sense of if you've ever experienced negative well-being, whether that's for a few moments, a few days, a few years, hopefully not, then it becomes almost self-evident that it would be better to not be in that negative state of well-being. And so I would say the majority of people, if not everybody, has experienced that, and so it becomes quite obvious why well-being is important. Now, when you look at the literature, and you look at our ability to evidence interventions and changes and modifications in the world, in the environment, in places, then you start to realise that although it's important, we don't really know what it is that we're trying to do when we try to improve well-being. It's a real problem, and we'll get this in lots of different fields. Every field will have a set of definitions for what they have that they're investigating, and they will say there's lots of different definitions, it's really hard to define. And it is, but I do feel like this sort of concept of well-being is particularly hard to define because it's so subjective. So if we were to go around the room and we were to ask, what does well-being mean to you? It's likely that there might be some convergence, but it's likely that there'll be a unique answer by everybody. And so when it comes to trying to investigate well-being in a coherent way, then we essentially are not able to do that very effectively. So there's a very poor evidence base around wellbeing interventions across different fields. And so I've been trying to help solve this problem. And the way that I've gone about that is try to merge psychological wellbeing into the construct of participation. And there are lots of different approaches to participation. However, the one which I would say is the second best definition of participation in the literature is by Granlund and Imms, and they also have a 2017 paper that's also very impactful as well. And this is the first of 3 slides with potentially complex graphics that might be overwhelming, but hopefully I'll extract what the key part of this is, because essentially what this definition is talking about participation. Participation is an experience, so it is an ongoing process of experience, but it's also an outcome. So it's a means, it's a process, and it's an end, it's an outcome. And so when you talk about how interventions work, it's not just that there's something about participating in an intervention that is related, it's that actually part of the intervention itself is the fact you're participating in it. So there's an overlap between them. And then there's also an overlap in the participation of the outcome, because right now we are living in an outcome. The outcome of us getting here this morning, for example. But it's also a process. And so by experiencing what we're experiencing now, our future participation will look different in some way. And so the way generally that interventions work within this approach is that interventions work through changing life experiences. And arguably that's how all interventions work. And so I've done some separate research, and this is for the research at the University of Northumbria. And this is taken from a framework which I've developed looking at belonging, and participation related constructs. And so I've taken lots of different constructs together which are not very well defined, that are very misunderstood, that are overlapping and contradictory, and I've tried to go, right, okay, this is what belonging is, for example, this is what involvement is, this is what engagement, etc., etc. is. And so what I did is I took the concept of participation as a means and an end, and then I've added some concrete aspects to it in order to better define what life experience, what human experience actually is. And so we have 3 different layers, and I won't go too much into this because it's more about the psychological well-being, but this is the backbone to it as such. And so essentially what we have is we have participation as the overall construct, and then we have, first of all, attendance. So in order to participate, you have to be somewhere, right? So that can be physically where we are now, or it could be if someone was joining online and there's a digital element to that, but you have to have some form of physical presence in order to participate. And then when you are in that environment, the involvement is essentially how you would describe what it was like when you were there. So you have attendance and involvement, and then engagement is the moment that we are living right now. So we are engaging in the world at this moment, and then involvement is when we talk about engagement retrospectively. So right now we're engaging in the world, and we could say how we're feeling or how we're doing, and then, but if I was to ask you tomorrow how you felt in this moment, that would be involvement. And so this is potentially solving a very long-standing problem of construct ambiguities, specifically within school intervention work, but also more broadly within the literature, of defining these 3 concepts, participation, involvement and engagement, through what would say time and space as such, very clear definitions. And so one of the implications of having this framework, when I was thinking about belonging specifically, essentially what felt really important with belonging is that as an educational psychologist within that field, we will often recommend and talk about how important a sense of belonging is to students' experience. And although we recognise it as important instinctively, the evidence base for why it's important, how it's important, and how it actually influences student behaviour and how it influences outcomes, although we know it does influence outcomes, how it does is not necessarily the clearest. And so one of the contributions of the framework is how sense of belonging, so this is engagement in this moment, right? So we experience a sense of belonging in an engagement experience, and then what we have there is we have the first person experience of belonging, and then we have engagement behaviour, which is then the observable part of that. And that's a really key aspect, because when it comes to well-being, if we are going to say that well-being is also a first person experience, it can only be experienced through that first person and only in that moment. And so it's the more I've thought about that, about how can you actually measure that, it becomes harder and harder and harder. But then this framework, this basis sort of explains that, well, we can't necessarily measure belonging directly, but what we can do is we can measure, I would say, that the antecedents of belonging experiences through involvement characteristics. So if you, for example, if I was to have a conversation to ask you about, how do you feel when you're on university campus? And if you're saying that you feel connected to the people that are there, if you feel agency in your work when you're there, then the likelihood is that you probably experience some sort of sense of belonging when you're there. But it's not a direct measurement. That is we're inferring it, we're guessing it, we're hypothesizing it based on how we've described our involvement in that specific place of the university campus. Okay, and so this is it's a preliminary approach to psychological well-being. It's very much in development and very much open to feedback and critique, but essentially the way that I'm thinking about well-being at this moment, psychological well-being, is across 2 different levels specifically. So you have the person-centered level, which is the first person experience, and then you also have the observable participation level, which is the level in which it is the direct concomitant, or it is the it's the aspect of engagement which is observable. So you have the first person experience, and then so when someone is looking at someone who's experiencing something, there are some aspects of that which is observable. And so, for example, only you as an individual can feel the emotions that you feel. As an observer, we can look at someone's affect, right? We can look at how they are presenting. And we know that it's not a perfect representation of emotions. And that's an important limitation when we are using different approaches within research. Because I would argue that these senses here, so it's been known for a long time that we experience the world through our senses, right? There's nothing controversial about that. We see things, we hear things, we touch things, but what this framework is starting to develop is an understanding of senses, of psychological senses, right? Subjective, affective senses. And so, in my project, I'll be evaluating the Philosophy for Children programme, and I'll be doing it in conjunction with children and young people. And so then when I'm asking young people about their experiences, it's not that I am objectively measuring well-being or capturing that. What I'm doing is I'm capturing their senses of their experiences. And that is really helpful to A, state how important it is to gather first-person experiences from the people who are experiencing interventions, but it also boundaries it, right? Because we have to acknowledge that well-being is more than just the experience, first person, is also the context and the attendance and the environment in which it happens in. And so it doesn't happen in a vacuum. Experience doesn't happen in a vacuum. We're here right now, we're in this building. If this building wasn't here, we wouldn't be experiencing anything. So we can't separate those two things. We can make distinctions, but we can't separate them. And so, for example, around this dimension here, we have sense of connectedness and relationships. And within my specific experiences, again, as a trainee educational psychologist, a typical situation can be that a young person may appear to have strong relationships with people within their schools. So that could be with their peers in the playground, it could be with school staff, etc. And this is the observable bit, right? Because you can see a young person, they're playing football with their friends and they're interacting. So we're saying that there's some objective part, we can see there's some relationships there. But actually what's really important, arguably the most important, if we're looking at it as an experience, is actually how it is experienced. And so those relationships are experienced through a sense of connectedness. And so this logic extends to all 6 of these different senses. And I don't want to present this as these are the 6 senses. I don't want to present this as this is a completed project or anything like that. But I think the distinctions made gives a really clear basis for future research to actually unify amongst a conceptualisation. Because what I've noticed quite a lot is quite often when I've looked at quantitative research and qualitative research, they have no choice currently but to define well-being in different ways. Because qualitative research will go, well, look, it's very complex. There's lots of different things that are happening in human experience. Lots of different things that are happening in human experience, and so how can you ever possibly condense that into a measure of an outcome pre and post, etc. So then their approaches are going to look very different to the quantitative side, and the quantitative side is going to go, well, we sort of do recognise that, but at the same time, if we want to do our jobs, we have to say that it is something that we can measure very clearly. But what in reality is, when we're looking at trying to develop, we're trying to create a world in which people are happy to be in, we have to take what I would say a realist approach. We have to say that experiences are subjective, but they're embedded within an objective participation condition. And I guess to finish on, the aspect of this framework which I think it needs the most development currently is this one down here. Because we have a sense of agency, could be a synonym of purpose or meaning, and currently the objective observable component is motivation. And if I'm honest, I'm not sure motivation is directly observable. And I've So be very open, specifically to this, but of course to any aspect that I've talked about today, because it is in development and it will develop and change over time. But thank you for listening. Hopefully it's helped you to think about things maybe a little bit differently. I'm really open to anybody who wants to ask any questions or anything like that. But yes, thank you.